As we gather today, we are erratically leaving an economic and social era that now goes by the name neoliberalism, and that has been going on for 40 years. Ellie Jupp's book helps us see a bit over the horizon into an era that doesn't exist yet, but that could be better than this one if we follow some of the leads of the research that she's unearthed. A quick bit of context. After many years of intellectual and political preparation, our current period began with the arrival of Margaret Thatcher to number 10 and Ronald Reagan to the White House in the fateful years 1979 to 81. Their mantras, as you know, were small government and personal responsibility, which were used to justify large tax cuts and the unraveling of collective structures like local authorities and trade unions. Then, towards the middle of our 40-year period, power shifted to New Labour in the UK and the New Democrats in the US. Both governments increased budgets, but kept the Thatcher-Reagan axioms. First, the private sector does everything better than the public sector, very much including public services. And second, the beneficiaries of public services are generally deficient people or families or communities, and they need correction by the services offered to them. Many of these people, it was assumed, would fake need in order to scrounge if given half a chance, so punitive incentives were central to the programs. Variations of discipline and punish remained in place after the financial crisis of 2008 and the arrival of the coalition government in the UK and of the Tea Party Republican Congress in the US, except now they operated under austerity's fiscal knife. I've always felt that the most shocking thing in neoliberalism was less the error in the theory or the cheapness or the short-sightedness about the developmental needs of one's own society, but the refusal to grant honor, honesty, intelligence, and creativity either to public service programs or to their clients and participants. It is impossible to sustain this refusal of respect even a few pages into Ellie's book. She combines an analysis of feminist and other social theories of care work with one story after another of thoughtful engagement and strenuous effort in the social projects and local authorities she studies. The grassroots thought and the often intimate effort consist of people and communities fighting the state's abandonment of their social infrastructure and at the same time reconstructing that infrastructure at least partially on their own terms. Ellie does not romanticize a do-it-yourself welfare state. She works through the ambivalences of local economies of care and points out the ways in which social enterprise cannot replace a properly funded state-run system. At the same time, she finds practices that build selves, families, and communities through everyday caring for children, elders, neighbors, and every once in a while, even oneself. Also, care work tends to have been conceived mainly through the experiences of white women and certainly of citizens of the country in question. Ellie also studies migrant mothers and communities of color, following Umet Irel and others in seeing these non-citizen mothers as enacting citizenship through caring for their children, while also negotiating everyday aspects of life in their home cultures. Ellie overcomes the traditional split between the emotional life of care and the strategic and policy life of politics. Towards the end of the book, discussing COVID lockdown care, she sees hope for better relations between communities and their everyday needs on the one hand, and governments on the other, as COVID government temporarily suspended its suspicions of the users and givers of care, at least long enough to be of real help. Then, if it sets a precedent or not is something maybe we'll get to talk about tonight. Okay, a word about the Independent Social Research Foundation, which is sponsoring this launch. Ellie's book is the 7th and last in the ISRF's second season of book launches. We recently published 2 issues of our bulletin on themes that emerge in her book as well as in many others over these 2 seasons. Living with Crisis is one, and Post-Individualism is the other, both exploring ways in which societies and individuals might mutually support each other rather than staying in conflict. Books launched this year include Eleanor Wall's on the role of affects in constituting political movements, Mike Mackin-Waite's on how community interventions dealt with white supremacist individualism in Burnley, Alexander Stingel's work on how collective engagement with digitality might reduce precarized labor, Jonathan Saha's book, Colonizing Animals, on how the colonial project decimated non-human creatures while also depending on relations with them. Julia Late's The Disappearance of Lydia Harvey, about a young New Zealand woman who was sex trafficked to London in the early 1900s, where a combination of individual battling and support structures produced a surprising ending to this story. And last month, Beverly Clough's book on rethinking disability law to reduce the contrast between the abled and disabled that weakens respectful care. All these authors, in different ways, are imagining real justice in a society that sees care as its foundation rather than as a burdensome afterthought. And I share their hope in the intelligence of everyday people as we try to work with each other to rebuild our world. The ISRF is extremely grateful to this collective body of authors and to their respondents for their work and thought and generosity. So thanks to you, Ellie, for the research that went into this book, and to you, Sarah and Andy, for contributing to what looks to me like a growing intellectual movement. Okay, so Lars has laid out the program, Ellie for 15 minutes, 5 to 7 for the others, more or less, possibly Ellie, and then we'll turn it over to you as soon as we can. So many thanks to all of you in the audience for being here to think with us about this important topic. All right, Eleanor Jupp is senior lecturer in social policy at the University of Kent, where she has worked since 2015. She has degrees in many fields, all of which have gone into this, I think. A BA in English and French from the University of Oxford, an MA in Anthropology and Cultural Studies from Goldsmiths College, London, and a PhD in Human Geography from the Open University. I mean, she's something of an ideal citizen of the interdisciplinary social sciences. Her research concerns shifting relations between policy frameworks and citizens with a focus on 2 areas: modes of collective action and citizenship within disadvantaged urban communities, and how families, children, and young people interact with welfare systems. She has co-edited or co-authored 2 previous books: Emotional States, Sites and Spaces of Affective Governance, and The New Politics of Home, Housing, Gender, and Care in Times of Crisis. That makes this your 3rd book in 5 years or so. Not that anyone's counting. She has an impressively long list of journal articles and book chapters, all the more remarkable because she spends quite a bit of time out in the world, having worked with Sure Start Children's Centers, along with the other organizations she discusses in this book in various regions of the country. The combination of in the study and in the street is somewhat exemplary in the world of the engaged social sciences and activist scholarship. So thank you, Ellie, for being with us, and turn it over to you.
And yeah, it's wonderful to be here. It's really delightful, and I have to say thank you so much to the ISRF for putting this event on, and also for supporting me in the last year. I've been really lucky to have a political economy fellowship from the ISRF, and they've been just a wonderful funder. We're talking about care today. They're a very supportive and caring organisation in the landscape of UK higher education, although I have many wonderful colleagues and friends. It's not always a caring one, as I'm sure you know, and they really have been wonderful to work with, so thank you. Thank you also to Andy and to Sarah, and thank you all for coming to celebrate the book with me, and to hopefully have an interesting conversation as well. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And talking about care, thank you also to others not in the room for various reasons, including particularly my partner Rowan. I've just been away for 2 weeks for work, and he's been looking after the kids. I'm looking after the kids tonight as well, so that I can be here. So he'll be watching this at some point, I hope. He's got a shout out. So I began this project around 5 years ago, as I was just telling people in the courtyard, although the actual writing of it was more compressed, but the idea for the book started 5 years ago. And at the time, the plan was to focus really on austerity, so the kind of cuts and reshaping of the welfare state since 2008 and 2010 in particular, with the coming of the Conservative coalition government in the UK. And the plan was for the book to sort of bring together two pieces of work that I've been doing over quite a few years. One is visiting Stoke-on-Trent and doing research in that city. It's a deindustrialising city in the Midlands, and I've been visiting communities and looking at community action there over several years and going back, rather fancily called longitudinal research, but to me it's about having those ongoing relationships and connections that is really interesting to revisit. And the other thing I've been doing is looking at changes to children's services since 2010, and particularly looking at children's centres, community spaces aimed at children under 5 and their families, and looking at cuts many of these centres have shut. In fact, the vast majority of them have since 2010. And I've been looking at what that means for communities, and also looking at forms of activism and response. So I wanted, those two projects are still really central in the book, as you'll see. And I wanted to look at kind of how social reproduction, as we might call it, how the kind of business of everyday life that's often gendered, so care and sort of keeping things going, comes under pressure during austerity, and the kind of reshaping of the welfare state and the local politics that might emerge. However, events kind of move on as well, and particularly writing the majority of this book really in the last year and a half. There's been a lot to get your head around, and in many ways it feels like austerity has been overlain by sort of broader senses of crisis. This idea of the perm crisis has been talked about recently. I'm not sure whether it may not be sort of necessarily politically helpful, but it's definitely perhaps captures the kind of feeling that many of us have around senses of crisis, economic, political, health with the pandemic, the cost of living crisis that's been talked about so much recently, the war in Ukraine. And I think in particular in the UK we have quite a sort of broken sense, I feel we have a broken sense of politics, and this is partly linked to Brexit. There's a real feeling of progress, I think, being rolled back, not just the state being rolled back, but some of those gains that perhaps we felt we've made in terms of welfare. And an almost existential sense of loss of support at times. We saw this during the pandemic in particular, I think. Will the state care for us, or will it enact actually neglect and even violence? And I have to mention, speaking about care, some of the things that have happened in the last few weeks. The anguish of witnessing state legislature take away access to reproductive health, with the abortion ruling in the US, and here in London, the Met Police continuing to show institutional racism and misogyny, especially against women of colour. And then we have, there's all that, and we have the environmental crisis as well. So austerity is still here, but I think it feels in many ways inseparable from these broader senses of crisis. So the pictures here, I meant to mention earlier, this is from a children's centre that had just closed, and then the other images are from a recent trip to Stoke-on-Trent, and the levelling. There was a poster about the levelling up agenda in the middle of a completely deserted shopping centre, and it really spoke to me about this sense of kind of broken politics. So the book in a way has become more wide-ranging than just being about austerity. I think it's trying to think about what happens in the spaces of these forms of crisis, and what sorts of localised action around care in particular might arise. So the book brings together different case studies, particularly around responding to poverty and inequality, and also needs during the pandemic. The book brings together projects in Stoke-on-Trent, London, parts of South England, including Kent, where I'm based. I can get into some more detail of some of the specifics of them later, but if you're interested. But this just gives a little flavour. So I talk about food provisioning, so this is a community fridge. I talk about a period poverty project in Kent, and that's an image that they were using to raise awareness of problems of access to period products, and I look at mutual aid in one chapter as well, the kind of ways in which food provisioning and support arose in the particular context of crisis of the pandemic. And I suppose in trying to assess these projects, in many ways, these are things that have arisen in this sense of crisis, and I think the notion of the sticking plaster, I start the book talking about the idea of the sticking plaster. I draw on some of Andy's work in thinking that through. And there's certainly, as Chris said, I tried to be critical about the limits and the difficulties and the problematics of these kinds of small-scale forms of community action. There's a lot of discussion about exhaustion and burnout, and some of the exclusions which also come with these kinds of projects. But the book, I hope, also celebrates creativity and persistence and determination to provide care. And I suppose the essential argument I want to make is that projects like this are not only enacting care, but they are also enacting a kind of everyday politics, and the title of the book. They're prefiguring, if you like, ways to perhaps do care differently, collectively. They speak to ideals of care beyond the home, beyond the individual household. They speak of solidarity, and they have affective qualities as well, and I explore that in the book. For example, the use of the digital space to sort of draw people into this sort of affective politics. I also, in the book, and I think this is another sort of contribution of it, I bring together these forms of community action and provisioning with other practices that might be what we might normally think of as activism, as politics or as citizenship. Centrally, a case study around campaigning against cuts to children's centres in various localities of the UK. But I want to argue is that both these forms of campaigning and the sort of provisioning and the everyday forms of care I mentioned earlier are sort of enacting care differently, are articulating different values around care, and certain claims are made in that process. And I think we see in people coming forward to protest against closures a kind of articulation and a yearning for everyday forms of collective care, or for infrastructures of collective care. So the image there comes from an animation that I made with children's centre service users who were campaigning against the closures of their centres. And we talked about the values of these collective spaces of the children's centre. Again, spaces of care beyond the family and the household. And again, the digital space was used by campaigners to draw attention to their practices, to their politics, to their visions of care that they wanted to put across. So, I've hopefully given you a little sense of some of the empirical material in the book. There are, as I say, a number of different case studies, and I wanted to just say something briefly about some of the theoretical resources that I used to try and do that in the book. I broadly use an intersectional feminist analysis which can help us think about how marginalised groups can enter politics, how practices which may not seem political can become part of politics. So Emma, Julia and Basil's work on minority women, again fighting austerity cuts, has been a particular reference point. Because they talk about care as ambivalent politics, involving both exhaustion and burnout and inequalities, but also transformation, creativity and becoming. Errol's work, as Chris mentioned, on what counts as citizenship, and her way of thinking about everyday acts of care as forming part of citizenship. And then, I mean, there's so much to think about, but in terms of Butler and colleagues' work on vulnerability, I've used that, and also from that book I took ideas about storytelling, how storytelling can be sort of an intervention into political discourse, because again I think that's important when you're talking about kind of marginalised groups, and that happened a lot around the children's centre closures, this notion of individual stories that can speak to the collective. And then as Chris said, I really want to keep thinking through the state in my work, because I think if you talk about localised action, it can end up moving to a critique where you suggest that the state shouldn't exist. But I want to try and think differently about how care and the state might be differently made, differently entangled. And I begin to get there at the end of the book, where I talk about infrastructures of care which might combine some of these sort of more formal and state structures with more informal and everyday forms of welfare and support. So, as I say, I get at the end of the book, it's very much towards a notion of infrastructures of care, because I don't at all want to say that these forms of localised action and activism provide all the answers to mending politics, to mending some of those crises that that was talked about at the beginning, that are confronting us. I talk quite a lot about methods in the book and about the notion of scholar activism, because I did really try to get alongside these projects in different ways, but also tried to hold on to a critique about their limitations and exclusions. And actually thinking about it for today, nearly all the projects, I guess, were failures in different ways. The children's centres all did shut. There was a legal challenge attached to one of the groups for particular reasons. It went all the way to a judicial review, and it was not successful. Most of the community groups that perform case studies no longer exist or don't exist in the forms that I've written about. Or where they do, there are particular reasons for being able to sustain themselves that are not necessarily, it doesn't mean that they're tackling the most important issues. There are inequalities, I think, around who's able to sustain community action and who aren't. But I really do think that we should still pay attention to these forms of activism and action, however fragile they may be and however far they may fail. I still think they are potent, I think they are politically productive. And I hope the book overall provides kind of fragile suggestions or glimpses of what might be thrown into relief. This is a picture of leaf printing, which I use in a slightly different way in the book actually. But what can these projects throw into relief about remaking society? What different ways of being might be imagined through paying attention to them? What are the emergent futures? And actually, I was thinking about this today, and I was browsing Twitter, as you do, and there was a tweet from Robbie Shilliam talking about Stuart Hall's, a set of questions posed by Stuart Hall in his last interview, which really spoke to what I was thinking about. What are the emergent? We need to pay attention to the present, he says. In the first instance, we need to analyse the current conjecture, but we also need to think about what are the emergent futures, what are the cracks and contradictions, and what is happening now that could be mobilised for a different politics. So I'm going to stop there.
All right, we're going to have the first of our two respondents at this point. The first is Dr. Sarah Hughes, who is a Vice Chancellor's Research Fellow in Human Geography at the University of Northumbria. She has both bachelor's and doctoral degrees in geography. Prior to her current position, she held an ESRC postdoctoral fellowship and a political geography teaching fellowship in the geography department at Durham University. Her research focuses on asylum politics, migration including forced migration, migrants' experiences of asylum governance, the nature of contemporary citizenship, and the politics of epistemology within the academy. Her projects also include a particularly intriguing one called Counter-Mapping Detention. Her articles analyze all sorts of interesting things, including beyond intentionality, exploring creativity and resistance within a UK immigration removal center, atmospheric memories, affect and minor politics at the 10-year anniversary of the London bombings, obfuscated democracy, Chelsea Manning and the politics of knowledge curation, and wait for a permanent contract, the temporal politics of infertility as an early career researcher. Sarah, thank you for being here.
So it's such an honour to be able to respond to this book, Ellie. Thank you so much for writing it. I've learned so much from reading it. And it feels very timely, I think, following on from what you and Chris have said about to be reading and commenting on care, crisis and activism, the politics of everyday life, in the context of the cost of living crisis, the transport strikes, the policing bill, the Roe versus Wade situation in America. So thank you, Ellie, for writing such a fantastic companion with which to help us navigate these increasingly turbulent times. Times which, as Laura Ballantyne called, the crisis ordinary. And I think that's something that I found kind of really helpful to think through when reading the book. So for those of you yet to read the book, Ellie's careful and nuanced reflective scholarship on community, local action and practices of care, and how these are entangled with austerity, crisis and the welfare state, is supported by a rich and longitudinal material, which is just explained. It's a series of projects over the years that take into account the ongoing COVID pandemic and the networks of mutual aid that emerged. And I think I'm from Kent, from the same area as you, so I found it kind of interesting to kind of think through that and kind of how my parents responded to those kind of things as well. But the book focuses on the everyday, the feelings, experiences, practices and actions of people outside the kind of realm of formal politics as a scale of analysis. And I think this lens is so important because this is how what we might term kind of a big P politics, what Ellie just explained is kind of broken politics, the austerity budgets resulting in cuts to Sure Start centres. This is where it plays out and is contested. But also because, as feminists have pointed out, the everyday is always already entwined with the complexity, situatedness, embodied criticality, constitutive qualities of emotional life. As Ellie powerfully shows us here, the everyday matters, not simply because it's down the hierarchy from policy decision makers, but because, as kind of Payne and Smith also note, attending to the specific materialities, spatialities, experiences and practices of emotions in particular contexts is more enlightening than kind of vague, utilitarian or hierarchical scaled understandings of politics. The cups of tea at the children's centre, the friendships between mothers, the Facebook groups, the paper offers of help pushed with sanitised hands through neighbours' doors during COVID, these are the messy intimacies of everyday life that Ellie's book so beautifully communicates. So I think care, crisis and activism is an important contribution to feminist work that urges us all to consider the everyday as the personal, the self, as always already political. So the rest of 5 to 7 minutes have been allocated. I wanted to highlight 3 themes: the politics of persistence, the ambiguity of hope, and the power of witnessing, that particularly spoke to me, and through these raised questions for us to perhaps think about in the wider discussion. Caveat here is that I don't work on austerity, as Chris just explained. My work's on migration, resistance, and creativity. But I think this is one of the real strengths of Ellie's book, is that it speaks beyond the specifics of its examples. And there's lots and lots that I take from this, and I will continue to take from this in my teaching and research. So first, the politics of persistence. I was really struck throughout on the relationship between resistance and persistence. So in the introduction, the book uses the language of Sandra, a community activist from Stoke-on-Trent, who explains that the food distribution project she was part of was a sticking plaster that wouldn't solve the issues kind of causing the problem, but it's meaningful immediately for those in pain. Ellie then goes on to contrast this with a comment from the head of a Sure Start centre, who stated that pre-austerity they were like the invisible cotton wool that wraps around our communities, highlighting a contrasting vision of collective care, and one that's softer and less immediate. And I'm aware that Andy is speaking after me in his work on food banks and the kind of sticking plasters, as Ellie's just mentioned, and in the meantime activities is something perhaps we can take further into discussion. But my question here is around the relationship between what is often seen on the one hand as resisting, so protesting, active activism, the quite masculine forms of resistance that call upon a particular agentic subject, and the persisting, often seemingly softer, keeping going despite of, because of the challenges. And I think Ellie's work shows us that this binary is not always helpful. Like the experiences of everyday life, the relationship between resistance and persistence is messier and more intimate than is often framed. So in doing so, I think what Ellie's work does is that we have a productive expansion of the term activist or kind of resistance that encompasses the kind of the multiplicity of at times incoherent resistant forms. And I think enduring those contradictions, the fact that these things don't quite fit into the neat categories of resisting, persisting, is key to understanding activism in the present moment. And I think kind of not writing these contradictions out of the possibility of politics, but staying with them, kind of staying with the trouble of them is really, really key here. So Ellie, my question to you is, how did you, in your research and your fieldwork, draw the line between what you call activism and the kind of the more kind of persistence, kind of keeping going, and how did that become problematized? So the second area I wanted to look at was the role of hope in the book, and in particular the ambiguity of hope. Ellie states that the overall argument in the book is that we should take seriously the practices and spaces explored as a messy but ultimately hopeful politics of everyday life. And there are so many examples throughout of people resisting and persisting despite huge challenges. Now, when I look at the world right now, I do not feel in any way hopeful. I just don't. That's not me disagreeing with Ellie, far from it. But I wanted to look at kind of what it means to hold on to hope as a means of engaging with political life. And I don't mean like Obama. And it's interesting because while activism and hope are commonly interlinked, I think they require quite different understandings of temporality. So resistance or activism is commonly understood as an action in the present towards a particular hopeful future. Right? Yet I think resistance and hope are grounded in different temporal ontologies. So by that I mean, for hope to exist, the future cannot be certain. The future has to be unsettled. It has to be in question. It has to be ambiguous. Resistance often relies upon this linear understanding of time. We act now for this outcome. We want this outcome. Whereas hope necessitates ambiguity that might not be. And that might not be, that emergent future might not always be positive. So holding on to kind of uncertainty and different ways of kind of the possibility for otherwise does also keep open the possibility of really right-wing politics. So it's how do you hold that kind of, that contradiction? So I really like in Ali's work how she explores how there was not necessarily a shared vision or shared set of values across, for example, the mutual aid project. The hoped-for end point wasn't necessarily the same. And that the local activism of anti-austerity politics, the migrant networks, and the mutual aid, none of them, apart from I think the she'll start sentence in chapter 5, link upwards with kind of wider struggles. So the resistance or persistence can't easily be articulated in a past, present, future framework. I think maybe reading some of Les Back's work in conversation with Ellie's here is quite helpful. So his argument that hope is not faith that delivers a future, rather than it's an attention to the present and the expectation that something will happen that will be unexpected and this will gift an unforeseen opportunity. So something interesting and important that I think emerges from Ellie's book here about taking the ambiguity of hope seriously, about hope as a relationship to the present rather than a relationship to a future, and understanding how the everyday is kind of shot through with multiple and conflicting emotions, experiences and temporalities that can't be neatly separated out into this kind of linear understanding. So my question, the question I wrote down is ridiculous. How do we engage with hope now? Like how, because that's just the question, right? How does hope feature in relation to the activist networks you explore, particularly when you just said they kind of quote unquote failed, or they haven't, they've lasted on in other ways. But how do we hold on to creating the kind of, the openness to a future that can be otherwise, that's not kind of slipping down the slope we seem to be going to? So finally, I'm almost out of time, but I wanted to show the kind of the power of witnessing. So Ellie's book highlights the political power of telling stories. This is sometimes explicit, so like the examples I really liked about how storytelling became woven into activism, but also the whole book is full of powerful stories bearing witness to the lives of so many people. Stories dance between the singular and the universal. They're reducible to neither, and yet they illuminate something about both. That's their power. And this book is a call to listen and take seriously stories through the politics of what's happening to these people in these places. But the book itself and Ellie's work is a witness to the kind of the orchestrated violences of austerity, the radical power of care, the denial of crisis, and that this is political. To bear witness, to remain with these uncertainties is a powerful political act. But I think this speaks to some of Ellie's kind of key discussions in the conclusion around the relationship between activism, academia, burnout, and self-care. How do you stay with this in a way that is, like, how do you endure? How do you remain, how do you not switch off? How do you stop, how do you not just keep scrolling? How do you remain in that moment and stay with that pain? So the question for Ellie, and I guess academics in the room, is how do we negotiate these boundaries? How do we kind of carefully, and putting a hyphen between care and fully there, how do we carefully create a kind of a way forward here? So I'm just going to end there, but thank you, Ellie, and thank you again for the invite today.
Next commentator is Dr. Andrew Williams. He is a senior lecturer in human geography at Cardiff University. He holds a BS in human geography from the University of Bristol and his PhD in the same field from the University of Exeter. His research examines the relationship between welfare, care, religion, and neoliberalism. He pursues these through a series of ethnographic engagements in specific contexts: faith-based drug and alcohol treatment, food banks and food cooperatives, homelessness services, among others. His current research topics also include Somali community needs in Cardiff and geographies of post-secularity. He's another of our fountains of productivity, with titles that include A Genealogy of the Food Bank, Faith-Based Alcohol Treatment in England and Wales, New Evidence for Policy and Practice, Post-Secularity, Political Resistance and Protest in the Occupy Movement, and Still Bleeding, The Variegated Geographies of Austerity and Food Banking in Rural England and Wales.
What I wanted just to share is just 2 or 3 brief thoughts. I loved reading this book. It's about the potentials and pitfalls of care and how it connects with shifting crises of austerity and COVID. And what I loved about it, theoretically, to quote again, Donna Haraway, it stays with the trouble. It kind of avoids that seduction of rushing in with the fixed or totalising categorisation of what's going on in the ground. It refuses to kind of gloss over the complexity, and it's kind of, in the text you can see that kind of agonism of how do I process this, how do I hold faithful or fidelity to the complexity of what's going on the ground, because I think it's very easy to kind of dismiss some of these sites and actors and activities as simply trivial or apolitical. And what I found really kind of critical about this book is its refusal to do that. So its refusal to kind of go along with the criticality of the self-proclaimed critical scholars. And another thing which I love about the book is it examines this fluidity between ethics and politics, the transitions between the two, the movements from local acts of care, of friendship, and routes to citizenship, of how it changes people's self-understanding and their relationships of responsibility to each other. So broadly, in terms of the headline, it broadens our view of what constitutes activism and resistance. It gets us to rethink citizenship and political subjectivity across a spectrum of spaces, sites, actors, and practices. And one thing I loved about it, it just really gets the importance of just very mundane or everyday acts of getting by, coping, which sustain kind of everyday life. And these things which are often overlooked are key sites in which people resist the disempowerment and the subjectification which they are made to feel within the kind of the stigma machine of welfare, but also kind of the effective politics of neoliberal capitalism. So that's the first thing which I loved about kind of the theoretical nuance with which you've brought to the book. The second thing which is linked to what Sarah was saying is this hopeful politics of everyday life. Kind of when we're studying care, examining the dark side or the ambivalences of care should never negate recognition of the capacities of care to galvanise a new politics or a new ethics. Just because we can write tomes upon tomes of the partiality or the complicity or kind of the unequal distribution of care doesn't mean that we should overlook or gloss over kind of some of the hopeful glimmers. And the book is very clear in its critique of the gendered effects of austerity on care relations. It also offers a really useful critical insight to the new spaces of mutual aid, which can be romanticised. And one of the things which I thought comes really strongly in that chapter is the stories of the burdens, how you wrestle with stigma and shame, the demarcation of who is vulnerable and who is not, kind of the unequal and fragmented support, kind of the people who are excluded from those mutual aid schemes because of digital illiteracy. But the story doesn't end there. And that's what I really like about that chapter. Kind of care is conceived more than just unwaged labour. You still hold in tension kind of this recognition that care embodies or holds within it a radical form of empathy, of community and connection across difference. And I think this is one of the things which I wanted to kind of pick up on, because it's an open space and there are lots of other actors trying to fill in that space. And I think we do have a fight on our hands in terms of the growing tides of more authoritarian, socially conservative and more reactionary kind of discourses which are trying to claim that space of community action and the language of care itself. So one of the things which I found really interesting about the book is if these are embryonic spaces of learning kind of the politics of care and learning alternative ethics and kind of political postures and practices, but what sort of grammars of analysis do we need to render visible these more hopeful glimmers so that we avoid the kind of the slippage into more kind of reactionary or kind of the more ambivalent or complicated kind of expressions of care. And then the last thing I wanted to share is again about the method. And I was really inspired by Eleanor, your position as kind of activist and researcher running through the whole book. That's threaded from chapter 1 to the end. And it's relatively unique to read a book which is kind of essentially longitudinal, starting off in 2004 with your PhD work. And then you return to the same participants in 2013, and how that brings to light kind of what's changed, and that fosters political reflection in itself. But within your methods, I found it really interesting how you're very honest with the tensions, the dilemmas, the way in which you're positioned as a researcher, researching uncomfortable kind of processes of crisis, of poverty, of vulnerability, and how you have this journey from kind of wrestling with the tensions of trying to avoid, the ethics of extraction, and then becoming a volunteer, working with and for community groups, like mucking in, observing, and then moving beyond that as well, of becoming an activist researcher, like showing leadership in terms of media engagement, local authority engagement, sitting on committees, and kind of standing up and being counted. And I think that's really exemplary of how to do political research. So in terms of questions, I've talked enough. I've got a couple of questions for you. What didn't make the cut? So what stories did you leave out, which you really wanted to tell? And second question, which is slightly harder, what types of infrastructures are needed to ensure that these more fleeting moments of care, of intimate strangers, of support, how do we prevent these just remaining momentary? How do we kind of pull these things and network them together? How do we avoid or prevent the appropriation of the language of care, empathy and community by reactionary forces, especially given you've got these new family hubs being kind of aligned with Conservative Party ideology and donors, which are kind of replacing Sure Start centres. And the question about storytelling is how do we organise these small-scale but deeply significant relations of care and support and speaking out to wider struggles, either within trade unions or within the professional charities and NGOs, because sometimes there's a barrier there of how stories become depoliticised or become a spectacle to be consumed. So those are some of the thoughts which I wanted to share, and I'll pass back to you.
Thank you so much for your generous readings and thoughts. I'm not entirely sure whether I can answer all that. There's some big questions in there, and I'll just try and grapple with them a little bit briefly, but I'd also love to hear what people in the room would like to ask about or talk about. So the line between sort of persistence and resistance, I'm not sure that I do. I suppose I try not to draw it really in the book, and I have, particularly thinking about kind of small-scale community action, maybe I don't make that argument quite so explicitly in this book, but I've argued for expanding activism to much more everyday forms of care and keeping going and sort of coping. As I spoke about, there are a number of different kind of modes of activism then, if you like, across the book. Some of them are about these kind of everyday forms of provisioning, and some of them are more what looks like resistance and activism. And I do think both of those things are really important. It's important to try and be visible at times and to confront power, but there's a sort of politics of care that I think weaves through both of those, and I think so paying detailed attention to the Sure Start campaign sort of, I think is a productive thing to do, but even though, as I say, it was sort of a failure. So I think there's something about the politics of care that is very entangled within both acts of persistence and resistance. And I suppose, how to hold on to hope. It is really difficult, and I do feel particularly depressed this week at times. I suppose care, in some ways care, as I say in the book, care is always already ongoing. It's always in the middle of things. It's always happening. It's, and care is inherently a hopeful set of practice. Well, it can, there is an inherently hopeful matter of sort of dynamic within care. I understand what you're saying about the future, but there's something about investing in others for the future which holds within it some sort of hope, I think. But I also think, I love what you said about hope as an attention to the present and starting to look at what is happening on the edges and what is happening on the margins, and coming back to the Roe versus Wade, ruling that this is going to be a fight, and there's going to be new forms of activism, and we don't give up, we just can't. But we're also allowed to have moments of hopelessness, for sure. Maybe that's also important at times. Andy, what stories did I leave out? In some ways that's quite a difficult question, because it was all kind of going back to, I had a lot of material, as you say, I brought it together in different ways, and some of them I gave more space to, and then I had a chapter on women whose stories I kind of weaved together, because I wanted to think about the commonalities between those projects. But I could have done a sort of case study by case study chapter, but I chose not to do that. So there was a lot of material on all those different, so the Migrant Women's Network, the Stoke Project, and the Period Poverty Project, which I could have expanded on that. And then the question about the sort of infrastructures and how to sort of hold on to care so that it's not just sort of fleeting, but also the sort of politics that might colonise or take over care. I think that's I don't have the answers to those. I think why I was talking about the state, it's so important to come back to forms of wider politics and to think about what are the wider discourses, how do these things get made visible and recognised, and they sure aren't at the moment. But we can't just have small-scale community action to enact care. We need these bigger structures, and I don't know quite what those are at the moment. And I think storytelling, I think, is really interesting, and there's more to think about that, because like you say, it's these kinds of stories which can be very affective, do move into different spaces, and can be read in different ways. And I speak in the book about, I can't remember whose phrase, but the idea of affective capital, that actually some people are able to speak their stories and others aren't, and that is problematic in some ways. But nonetheless, I think storytelling can enable experience to move into public spheres that wouldn't be able to, and it gives people a point of entry to politics, and like you say, to sort of connect the collective and the individual. I think that's all I'm going to say now, if that's okay, and I'd like to hear what other people would like to say. Yeah, well, there's lots of, I talk about care as unequally distributed in society, and care is generally done, by women of colour, women who are not well paid. These are not people who are easily able to enter politics and find a voice and influence policy and undertake activism, and that's really why I pay so much attention to the everyday within the book. But there should be. And sometimes, the cost of living crisis is such, it is massive. And going out, the project I'm doing at the moment, funded by the ISRF, is somewhat similar, and I'm going out and talking to different community groups at the moment, and the cost of living, however we want to frame it, is such a massive thing coming down the road in terms of poverty and just people not going to be able to cope. And maybe that is maybe there is going to be, people on the streets talking about care and poverty. I hope so. Yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe something about narrative or witness or something might be better. But there is some interesting work. And
you have a BA in English and French.
Yeah, that's true.
Don't betray that bachelor's degree.
Yeah, fiction. Fiction is certainly powerful and can illuminate new worlds and make us think differently about society. But it really actually just did come from, particularly with the Children's Centre, the anti-austerity activists, they really wanted to tell me their stories, and that was a phrase that was used. And the interviews I did around that, people spoke about struggles around care, and they often had very complex stories that did sort of have a beginning, middle, and an end about. So most of that, because it's about young children, mostly it's about becoming parents, often in very traumatic situations. And then actually the migrant women's group, they also tended to have long narratives they wanted to talk to me about around the experience of migration and the trauma of migration. And there was a sort of arc there that I think in that data that that's why I sort of used that framing. But it shouldn't sound twee. I hope, there may be other ways to phrase it as well.
Can I just add one? I think one of the powers of narrative is that you take things that are out of the light of day and that are attached to shame and that people hide, and you speak them and you take the shame away, and they can then be part of both the evidence-based testimony to government officials or whatever. But more importantly, I think this is something that you really talk about in your book. It changes the affect or the feelings that the community has about the possibility of action and effectiveness. In other words, it's not shameful to be poor or to be a migrant. It's, in fact, an impressive accomplishment that you've got this far and that you're persisting and surviving. And I think narrative is actually the place where that happens. It's not the only place, but it's one of its powers. Sorry.
Thank you. Can I jump in there as well? Because I was thinking about this when I was writing my section on kind of witnessing and stories. And I was thinking, what do we call, with qualitative research, do we call it story? And then I was thinking about example. That's kind of often the word that would be used, in qualitative research. But example example in German is Beispiel. It means to play with, to play alongside the given. And I think there's something about stories that captures that creativity, rather than fictional as in opposed to factual, but about creativity, which is so rich in this book, that I think stories do capture. It's interesting. Anyway, it's a really good question.
In terms of whether people thought they were sort of creating a new society, generally not. The only place that was talked about was in the mutual aid case study. And I'm not sure that was the case in other places either, but some of the people involved in that project said, we want to see the end of capitalism. This is partly why we're doing this. And that was interesting because it was, that was explicitly political, even though in some ways the practices involved were the most everyday imaginable. It really was about shopping, medication, checking in on people. So that's interesting, and that's an interesting moment, I suppose, because it did, and I think it was also linked to that sense of crisis, there really was a sense of total failure of, I mean, there is anyway, but at that particular sort of infrastructures around us, but also who was involved and who came to that project. I think for other projects, no, I mean, I think anyone operating in this space is very aware of, I mean, there are different spaces across the project in terms of policy and austerity and what's wrong with the current political and economic settlement. So that is talked about a lot. And some of the projects, depending on who they were, how the position did do sort of campaigning alongside the more sort of everyday provisioning. I think that the state, I mean, this is one of the tensions that I'm trying to work with in the book, and I haven't resolved it at all, because we can't romanticise the state either in terms of care. You know, there's so much violence and so much suffering that's enacted. So I think one of the reasons why I'm interested in these kind of everyday experiments, if you like, is that I think they can, they can work through some of those difficulties and issues in different ways, and maybe the state can learn from them as well. But yes, I think, you know, things like the loss of the children's centres, that's still down. I think it is still on the table, although one of the things I didn't really have time to get into in the book is that the sort of duplicity of how these things have been sort of eroded, so it becomes very hard to see what's visible and what's there and what services are still actually out there. So it is a very kind of slippery terrain in terms of those cuts and how they've eroded what's available. Thank you, that's really interesting question. And I mean, you've written interestingly about this space as well. I think, I mean, yeah, as I said in the book, and as others have said, part of the kind of duplicity, if you like, of austerity is that there hasn't been a national debate about children's centres, for example. There's not been a discussion and a discourse about the fact we don't want them anymore. There's been massive cuts, the sort of ring fencing and the policy, and it's all very sort of complex, but the protected nature of them as a service has been taken away, and it's been kind of left then to local authorities to manage that politics. And I feel, I mean, having interviewed local authority actors, you know, across the case studies, that it's very hard to have a sort of pragmatic conversation about, and a realistic conversation about what's going on in terms of the resources and what they could do and what could be sort of progressive solutions given the context they're in. There's a lot of sort of rebranding of service cuts essentially as something positive and transformational. Esther Hitchin writes really well about this as well in terms of libraries, and that's where the kind of politics happens. This is also the problem with austerity politics, is because the politics happens at that local level and at council meetings and so on, and so the sort of actually the taking on of national politics doesn't really happen in those struggles somehow. I think, you know, the Children's Centre campaign did have support from the Labour group within the council, one of the case studies, or both the case study actually areas. They were all Conservative controlled authorities actually, where I did the majority of the work across all the case studies. But there were progressive factions from the council, there were trade union movements, there were some other structures, and yeah, it wasn't very hopeful overall. But it's an important question. So do any of you want to respond on these questions?
I'm surprisingly out of the mood today.
Okay, go on.
It's the first time in a long time to speak. I believe that there is possibility of being strategic in appropriating the tools of local government to use unused stores on high streets, to kind of try to anticipate what they want, and then for mutual aid groups or progressive groups to have land and space to do what they want. So I think if we can wrap that in a way which fits their agenda of, like in terms of kind of community food growing, and food justice, like one of the challenges is a lack of space. And I think if we can be a little bit more strategic of popularising access to kind of local council owned land. Do you remember that? Council used to own land before they sold it off. Sorry, joke. But yeah, that's one of the ways in which they've kind of weathered the storm. But yeah, I'm looking at the next 4 or 5 years with local authorities, and your research on this, like, you know this better than me, like, it's going to be very ugly in terms of local authorities going bankrupt. So my hopeful side would like to see other particular spaces or collaborations which would bring about some sort of social justice which we can use, but that would require just a preparation. So.
The oldest dying, the future cannot yet be born. I can't remember who's. Is it
Gramsci.
Gramsci, yeah. I'm not sure. I mean, that was very generous of Chris to say that it's you know, well, actually maybe you asked this question, how we're moving beyond neoliberalism. So I'm not sure that I make that claim in the book that we are beyond it, or that these bases are sort of prefigure neoliberalism. I suppose it's trying to look at those kind of cracks and crevices, and the fact that within a context of politics feeling quite hopeless, that there are these forms of collective care or solidarity, and that there's something about the everyday materiality, I think, of sort of being togetherness, which really does persist when so much is being taken away. And I think, I don't have a sort of programmatic vision of how we're going to get to a future, but I think politics is divisive. It should be divisive at times. It should be confrontational, that's for sure. But also sometimes there are kind of material and sort of careful spaces which can bring people together in different ways, connect across difference, I think, which are important. But I think it's about sort of subjectivities and about stories and about care. I haven't got the sort of manifesto for the future yet. Yeah, I mean, in terms of the pandemic, and I think there's a lot to say, and again, I could have written more about that in terms of sort of shifting atmospheres, and I think of it, that sort of moment at the beginning when, someone said to me, they said to me in retrospect, I thought it was the end of capitalism, but, she was telling me then, now I know that it wasn't, now I see that it wasn't. And so I do talk about sort of temporal phases and the sort of different politics of the pandemic as well, as time went on, and I think, I think sort of cynicism and in terms of persisting, we all, the different lockdowns and so on, I think had different kind of atmospheres in politics, and the relationship with the state also changed at different times, didn't it? I don't think I have one answer, but I think there were different phases, and it was really interesting doing the interviews in the autumn of 2020, because in terms of story and narrative, there was that kind of sense of those what was the significance of what happened in that first lockdown was sort of being grappled with by people talking about it then, and it was still quite up in the air. It wasn't set necessarily, but it was clear that something had changed by the autumn. They didn't really see the sort of hope in the same way anymore. Failures and so on. Well, it's really hard to say because the projects in the book are quite different. Some of them are sort of community organisations which shut. Some of them are, so the Children's Centre campaigners, the centres. There were some concessions made in the two areas that I looked at in particular. There were some changes made, and that was, I have to say, that was partly because of actually council meetings. So as a site of politics where people stood up and really spoke from the heart about places meant to them, and there was then some rearranging of resources and things. So there were some successes, but the overall project to try and keep the centres open failed. But then other things, like you say, those group networks, I think, are engaging with different things now. Other things kind of come into the frame, and I do think, and Sarah's written about this really well. You know, activism, it has all kinds of taking part in activism can kind of spin out in different ways, in unexpected ways. It's not necessarily a sort of trajectory to empowerment in a straightforward way.
It doesn't link. So I just keep thinking about, so quite a lot of my work is in immigration detention centres or with immigration detention centres, and Mighty, who run quite a lot of them, their slogan is care and custody.
Right.
And when you walk in on the street, it says care, we care. And I keep thinking about that. I kept thinking about that in the book. I was like, how do I think about this? How do I engage with this? Because actually, it's almost like we see the critique coming and and we're saying we do it. And how in situations and institutions of violence has that been? I mean, it's not the same as the work you're doing on the ground in these kind of more intimate kind of messiness. But I often, from talking to people who've been in those centres, their understanding of what care is Mighty, right? That is that company, because the English language is that this is, and that's just it's something really perverted about that I keep coming back to. I don't really know how to formulate that into anything more.
And it is, I mean, that the notion of care is definitely rejected completely by some sets of activists. So, for example, I mean, I've just been examining a PhD thesis around mental health activism and disability activism, and she rejected discussions about care entirely as a term, because it's seen so problematic by those groups because of their experiences of care within the system.
But that contradiction is really important, I think, and I think that links to what Kate was saying. It's like holding on to contradictions is where you find hope, right? Because it's the only way we can do it, is to allow for things to be both and stay with that. But that takes time and energy and a care.
Let's continue this out in the courtyard next to the bar. Please join me in thanking Ellie and the